could you tell me how big of an audience we have, and are most everybody on the engineering side? Do we have architects? Do we have anybody from hospitals? Give me a little bit of a feel for that, please.
Sure. We've got 26 attendees, 27 now, and that will probably in the next 5 minutes increase to maybe 50 or so that we had registered. Most of them are the engineers. There's a couple from some owners that I see here, and there's a few territory or our territory managers that we have for TEC. But most of them are engineers, Mark.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for your attention. My name is Mark Arith. I have the pleasure of running into Frank Stamatatos a few years back, and we started talking about our common interest in keeping hospitals safe. And my background is that I'm an anesthesiologist, and I spent 25 years at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, primarily involved in cardiac anesthesiology, heart, lung, liver transplants, as well as critical care. And in my work there, you know, we spent an awful lot of time focused on hand washing, as we still do to this day, to this date. And we also spent a lot of time focusing on appropriate antibiotic usage and all kinds of other things. But we virtually never talked about airborne contamination. And so that's one of the things that we'll be touching on today. So I spent a lot of time, you know, I lived in the operating room for almost 30 years. And so I'm in this space, and so I have a good understanding as to what is necessary to help make sure that we have clean room levels of reduced contamination for our patients. Mr. Stamatatos is the CEO of Secure Air. I'll let Frank introduce himself.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Again, Frank Stamatatos, I'm President and CEO of Secure Air, and we have truly a unique technology. And with the current critical care issues facing really the world in healthcare, we thought our collaboration with Dr. Arith would be a great thing for the company and for the technology. So that's how we've aligned our healthcare segment. And as a matter of professional training, I have nearly 30+ years experience in the filtration space. So when we talk about filtration, that comes from an in-depth background. And Mark, I think we'll kick it back to you to start the program.
All right. Sounds good. Well, I'm going to start to advance through the slides. I guess I should have had this slide up. There we are. So our objective today, and please interrupt me if for some reason there's a question that comes up, or if we have some technical issue or you're having trouble hearing me. So we're going to focus on a number of things today, essentially talking about indoor air pollution and disease, because there's a very tight relationship there. Hospital-acquired infection, kind of the status of some current air cleansing technology, and then talk a little bit about the science of particle movement. Then we're going to discuss our novel approach, and then share with you the results from our laboratory and hospital experimentation. So I think most everybody knows that, you know, if you think about yourself, we now know that about 90% of us spend greater than 90% of the time indoors, whether it's at work, at home, in an office, in a factory. Nonetheless, we are almost all of us spending a lot of time indoor. Unfortunately, you know, if we think about the advancements in air cleansing technology, there really are some significant limitations on what's actually happened. We all talk about HEPA every day, but HEPA, of course, was invented, you know, 70 years ago, and we haven't really seen significant changes in this space for a very, very long time. Now, I'm from Minnesota, and I know that 3M, of course, has all their coatings that can, you know, certainly find, or they can tune filters to pick up certain things. But other than those iterations with coatings, we really haven't seen much, much progress. Traditionally, we, of course, just filter particles, but of course we know that it's hard to filter down to the very, very small size. The other thing that we know is that we do know that particle control does prevent infection, and there's both our data and other data in the literature to support that. So this is a diagram here, and the reference is there from Pennsylvania State. And if you look about 3/4 the way down the figure, you'll see that line, the darker line where it says that's 1 micron in size. So we have size on the y-axis and differing types of viruses on the x-axis. And as I advance through here, you'll begin to see all of these various pathogens that are really very, very small. In fact, everything that we really worry about is really kind of at Staph aureus right there, just under 1 micron, and everything else is much smaller. Anthrax, you see, is just slightly higher. Typhoid fever, we don't think about too much in the United States, but even it is still very small at only 1.5 microns. May I ask a question? Are you able to see my cursor? I'm thinking not. At any rate, so let's move on.
Mark, we can see your cursor. Yeah.
You can?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So beautiful. So, you know, most of you have heard about atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries. We could spend days talking about it. Basically, it's a lipid and fibrous plaque that builds up. Well, it turns out that airborne fine particulate matter that is less than 2.5 or PM 2.5 that you all commonly use as normal nomenclature, that it promotes hardening of the arteries. And if we look at it specifically, we look at the various mechanisms, it mediates a variety of mechanisms that all contribute. So these 5 characteristics are important because there's pro-oxidant, pro-inflammatory mechanisms that affect all of these different cell types in the body as well as organs. Plus, there are additional molecular mediators in response to these, and all of these contribute to atherosclerosis. So if you think about fine particle contamination in the air, being exposed to it for hours at a time or hours each day can lead to significant atherosclerosis. We also know now that there is a linkage between air pollution and dementia. And this was the Popular Press article from 2 years ago, but we know that there's actually more important information associated with this that I'll share in a few seconds. But nonetheless, air pollution contributes to dementia, and it is thought to be responsible for up to 14% of the dementia worldwide. So that's a big number. How about cognitive function? You know, let's think about healthcare. Let's think about people that are doing critical jobs every day. You know, you can talk about police officers on the streets of New York. You can talk about, air traffic controllers in towers which may not have adequate ventilation. We talk about office workers, and this is one of the first of a couple of studies that looked at the effect of cognitive function in office air quality. So this is the study that comes to us from Harvard University. It was funded by the National Institutes of Health, and it looked at 8 different functions or measures of cognitive function, 8 different indexes. And in essence, and you don't have to read all the details, but in essence, this was in the dark gray, a conventional office. They used the exact same space. They just changed in a very controlled fashion. They changed it from a conventional ventilation to a green ventilation, and then to what they call as green plus, which was going far beyond normal rates by taking the regular green and adding a high turnover of the airflow. And so in essence, and I've expanded it here for you, here we have the score that is normalized to the green for all of these various measures, again, metrics. And if you look off to the far side here, you know, crisis response, information seeking, information usage, breadth of approach, and strategy. All of these things are critical in what most of us do on a day-to-day basis. And here you can look at it. Here we are, crisis response. Look at this is a normal office. Look what happens if you're in a green office. And then look what happens if you add fresh air turnover in addition to that green office, and look at the differences here. And it's uniformly across the board here. You go from conventional to green plus. And so this should suggest to us that PM 2.5 or smaller are significantly associated with a reduction in cognitive function, and as such, obviously a reduction in workflow, a reduction in probably safety if you're talking about air traffic controllers, for instance, and other things. Let's jump a little bit towards Alzheimer's disease now. We have an epidemic in this country. Many of you have heard all about it. Most everybody in the room probably has a relative that has suffered from Alzheimer's disease or has a friend with a relative that has. And right now we have around 5 to 6 million patients in this country with Alzheimer's, but that's going to more than double by the year 2050. And this is just from the Harvard Gazette just last April. And here's the total cost of treating patients with Alzheimer's. Here we are in 2015, and that number was $200 billion per year. Well, unchecked, this number is going to rise up to $1 trillion per year if we don't do something about this. So not only are we facing a healthcare crisis, but this alone will consume over 30% of every healthcare dollar in this country by the year 2050 if we don't do something about it. All right, so I'm sure that some of you may have had classes in college, maybe genetics classes, and I'm sure that many of you understand this basic concept here, that in general, we have genes that are that we get from our mother and our father, of course, and the genetic expression of those genes, or the phenotype that's expressed, whether it's eye color, hair color, body habiture, or sensitivity to environmental triggers, that phenotype is expressed with a combination of drugs, diet, lifestyle, and in this case, your environment, along with the microbiome in your gut. And all of those things lead to modifications in metabolism, which then show up as a modification in the phenotype, or what is shown. And so this next slide does a nice summary of looking at nature versus nurture. So if you take a look here off to the right side, we've got 4 various genes that are involved in the development of a complex disease. And then you have 4 other factors: diet, exercise, ethnicity, and gender, okay? And as an example, if you just look at the genetic risk factors, that does not have enough to get you to that threshold to develop this complex disease. And then if you're just looking at these non-genetic risk factors here, that neither does that get you to a threshold to develop this complex disease. But now if you combine some bad genes with some bad environmental triggers or lifestyle choices, then you get up to that threshold where you're going to develop disease. And as an example, we can think about this. As an example, we can think about environmental air exposure as it comes into play right here as one of those environmental triggers that can lead to development of disease. So the first thing we have today is what has the greatest effect on complex disease development? And I believe you can all respond to these: genetic factors, environmental air exposure, or ethnicity. Now remember, oh, there we go.
Okay, we're going to give you maybe 30 seconds here to answer it, and then we'll give you the answer and tell you how many people answered which one. All right, I'm going to close the voting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, The answer is environmental exposure, and 84% of you got that correct.
Absolutely. Good job. And a
Right.
lot of smart folks there. Yeah, it's really funny because we don't normally think of environmental air exposure as being such an important part, but when we talk about heart disease, vascular disease, we're talking about strokes and heart attacks, when we talk about dementia, Alzheimer's, it is a gigantic component. And also when we start to think about contamination in hospitals. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about genetics, okay? So remember, you had some bad genes with a bad environment led to a disease. Well, let's see if any of you happen to know what ApoE is. I wouldn't expect it, but ApoE is apolipoprotein E, which is a long word, and it's there are various alleles or variations in this protein that we get. And depending upon where you, what your mom and dad have, you will either be born, you will either have a ApoE2, 3, or 4 version, okay? So one of those 3 versions is what you get, and you get a pair of those. So if you're lucky, and I don't think I probably am because of my family history, but if you're lucky and you get ApoE2, that's a very rare form of the gene, and it actually is very protective against Alzheimer's. So if you're lucky enough to have that, you're going to be in a good situation. If you have ApoE3, that's a very common form of the gene that does not influence risk, which is fortunate. But if you're unfortunate enough to get ApoE4, again, the 4 subscript being that version of it, well, that's only present in about 20% of the population, but it unfortunately increases your risk of developing Alzheimer's, and it actually accelerates or lowers the onset of the disease. Now, the bad news is if you got an ApoE4 from both your mom and your dad, you have a 12 times increased risk in developing Alzheimer's. So much of the current drugs that are under investigation are looking at how do we modify ApoE4 to be more ApoE2-like. So that's much of the work that's going on right now. So once again, if you have some bad genes and then you throw that environmental trigger on top of it, you're going to really almost be certain that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. So we got 2 slides coming up here, 2 studies. This is from the from Translational Psychiatry, from last part of Nature, from last January of this year. And in it, they looked at 2 different things. They looked at an animal model, and they also looked at cognitive impairment in older women. And on the first side, they used the Women's Health Initiative memory study here in Boston, and I happen to be in Boston right now. And they looked at the neurodegenerative effects of ambient particulate air. And it turns out that if you reside within an area that has particulate matter that is greater or above EPA standards, that you have a significant increase of developing Alzheimer's disease. You basically double your chance of developing Alzheimer's. And then if you've got the ApoE4, remember the bad gene, then you actually go to about 4 times or 4x the chance. So again, bad gene, bad environment, you're going to get the cancer. Excuse me, you're going to get the Alzheimer's disease. So the next study, the next part of this study, these folks, these investigators looked at the ApoE alleles and their contributions to amyloidogenesis, if you want to try and say that fast, in experimental models. So what they did is they used a technique whereby you can knock out genes in mice. They're called knockout mice. So you can turn on or turn off certain genes. And what they did is they looked at various mice models with knockout genes, and they exposed these mice to 225 hours of urban nano-sized particles, okay, over a 15-week period. What they were going after was trying to simulate something as if you were commuting to work maybe 70 minutes each way each day. And so that's kind of how they were trying to devise this experiment. Well, they found out that compared to the controls with the regular ApoE4, if you had ApoE4 plus environmental nanosized particulate exposure, then you had an increased development of this beta amyloid, and you had significant shrinking or atrophy of certain parts of the brain and certain neurons within the brain. And in addition to that, in another part of the brain, you had an increase in this amyloid precursor protein. So there was a buildup of the precursor protein that is then rapidly converted to amyloid. And so once again, we have both human and animal evidence to suggest that there is a significant linkage between small particles that are contaminating our air and Alzheimer's disease. Are there any questions at the moment? I've kind of been running on.
No, Mark, there have been no questions so far.
All right, so here's I made the statement earlier that the WHO, the World Health Organization, tells us that they believe that air pollution is responsible for 14% of dementia. It's a massive problem. So here's the interesting thing about smoking and particulate air pollution, okay? There is no safe threshold, okay? If you have one cigarette, or if you're exposed to 1 hour of high quantities of low size particles, you are increasing your risk. And so there is no safe threshold. The more exposure, the greater the risk of developing a particulate air pollution related complication. All right, let's step into hospital acquired infections. Mr. Stamatatos and I differ on these numbers. We both have different sources, but we know for a fact that hospital acquired infections, that is those infections you get while you're in the hospital, not that you bring to the hospital, these cost us tens of billions of dollars every year. And in fact, the number could be as high as $43 billion. Pneumonia alone is about $3 billion. And so this affects 2 million patients every year, affects 75,000 families who have a death in the family as a result of hospital-acquired infections. So this is a major healthcare concern. Some of the most dangerous hospital-acquired pathogens are methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. Again, sitting right there at 1 micron in size, they are generally not filtered out by HEPA filtration. And there are a couple of other species here. The other thing that you've all heard about is antibiotic resistance, and we know that now airborne disease transmission is rising in hospitals, and we also know that antibiotic resistance and development of these superbugs is increasing as well. All the more reason we should think about decontaminating our air in hospital environments. Frank, do you want to take over here? Because we're kind of at the, here we are with the manual from ASHRAE. So Mr. Stamatatos.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Okay, so most of you know that in this industry, ASHRAE is the governing body, if you will. And ASHRAE has already put out a number of design manuals for hospital and clinics, with the first edition coming out in 2013 and the second edition coming out in late 2014. And I believe there's a third edition actually underway currently. And there's a couple of things in there that that really lead us to discussion and further understanding. So when it talks about HVAC system and infection control, we look at the science for controlling infections. And if we read that first paragraph, it talks about how we actually prevent or reduce the infections caused by airborne microorganisms. And it looks at engineering, particle physics, and microbiology, and lastly, medicine as part of the solution for that. And then it talks about turbulence in a room and how it relates to the size, shape, and density of the particles in the room. But probably the most important thing that most people don't understand fully is that when you talk about small particles, most of those small particles are virtually unaffected by gravity. And there's a thing, if you remember back from high school physics, called Brownian motion. And Brownian motion is what takes over. So that basically tells you that small particles stay in suspension within the indoor space. And the question would be, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I think if we look back earlier to some of the slides that Dr. Arith had shared with us, that is not a good thing. So now if we talk a little further about a cough or a sneeze, we used to think that the area that was critical was only 3 to 6 feet. And then it talks about it being virtually impossible for the HVAC system to exert control at this close exposure. And I think the close exposure, maybe we should put that in quotes. And then we talk about transfer must be controlled. So Mark, if you click one more, our friends at MIT have now told us that the aerosol from a cough or a sneeze can actually travel up to 200 feet. That, I would say, is dramatically different from the 3 to 6 feet to where we started. So to question 2, what affects particle motion on particles below 1 micron in size? Newtonian physics, A, the Bernoulli effect, B, or C, Brownian motion?
Okay, we'll give everybody about 30 seconds to answer this question, and we'll tell you the results. Okay, we're going to close the poll, and the answer is C, Brownian motion, and 88% of you got that correct. And we have no questions, so if you have any questions, type them in the questions box on the bottom right-hand side of the navigation pane, or go to a webinar. So you're doing a great job, Mark and Frank. You can continue on.
Okay, so when we talk about mitigating airborne pathogens, typically from a design standpoint, we talk about dilution, certainly filtration, pressurization, disinfection, UV, and upper air within the room, which really talks about laminar flow, and also air curtains fall into that last category. Okay, so let's talk about conventional methods of air filtration. So here's the critical thing, is that regardless of filtration rating, all conventional methods of mechanical filtration have a major flaw. And that major flaw is if the contaminants don't get to the device, they will not remove them from the space. So if we look on the left-hand side, you're looking at a typical schematic of an operating room. You can see the air handler, pre and final filters, as well as the HEPA modules, which provide you your laminar flow and quote-unquote HEPA grade filtration. And if we think about the critical zone, that would actually be right above the patient, right? That's where we don't want the contamination to sit. However, if you look at the photograph on the right-hand side, we've actually done studies relative to small airborne contaminants that are less than roughly 3 microns in size. And amazingly, you can see that that Brownian motion leaves those contaminants in the absolute worst place, which is right above the patient. So from our perspective, the Brownian motion effect is hugely critical to actually removing the contamination from the space. So, measurement and verification. One of the things that we strongly believe in is the ability to measure and verify performance. As engineers and as technical folks, if we're not measuring and verifying, what actually are we doing? How do we know that our devices are actually operating as they're intended? So when we talk about measurement and verification, typically you'll start out at a known place, which we call the baseline, and then drift is associated with an event, whatever that event may be, and then recovery is how fast can you mitigate that drift or event, and then hopefully we settle at a new and lower baseline than we started with. That's really what we're after when it comes to airborne contaminants and measuring their effectiveness. So again, it's all about baseline drift recovery, hopefully to get to a new baseline. And what's important is that that drift, we want to mitigate that and make sure that we shrink it as well as we can. And also our recovery. Our recovery wants to be as minimal as possible. So we run numerous different types of tests. And in the case that we're showing here is that we're basically doing a controlled smoke match test, which measures particle contaminants at roughly 0.4 microns in size. And as you can see in the red, that's what it looks like typically with our device off. And we've superimposed what it looks like with our device on. So as you can see, that drift and recovery are very, very well controlled when you have particle control technology working for you. So what is particle control technology and what are the steps? So basically, I think we would all agree that there is no 100% effective air filter. Every air filter, regardless of what it is, lets some contamination through. So what we do with particle control is actually utilize what gets through in a 5-step process. So the first thing we do is condition particles that come into the device with charge. When you utilize charge to condition, we also force those particles to collide. And of course, once they collide, they gain mass, which gives us an advantage. The other really, really important thing is that we create net neutral, overall net neutral particles that exit the device. That gives the ability for the particles to be more easily captured, as well as whatever we capture that's viable from an indoor air pathogen standpoint, we have the ability to kill. And our net neutral particles that get through the system, well, they actually help us clean the space. If you think about a micro sponge, that's basically what we're creating. So if we were to actually look at a cubic foot of indoor air, a cubic foot of indoor air has roughly 20 million particles in that air. Now, here's the thing again that most people don't understand very well. Within that 20 million, there are certain particle sizes that are actually affected by airflow. And if we do some quick math in adding up those categories covered under that blue arrow, you'll see that it's roughly 86,000 out of 20 million are actually controlled with airflow. The balance is being held in the space by an electromagnetic field. And of course, as we know, the particle size where those airborne pathogens reside is in the smaller sizes. And what particle control technology is all about is giving you the ability to move those particles from the control of the electromagnetic field to the airflow side of the equation so that you can use airflow as that tool. So particle control technology gives you the ability to use airflow as your ability to transfer airborne contaminants out of your space. So question 3, what is the most effective way to remove critical airborne contaminants from a treated environment? A, gravity, B, airflow, C, particle control technology.
Okay, everybody, we're going to give you about 30 seconds here. Okay, everybody, we're going to close the polls, and the answer is C, and 88% of you did get that correctly. Very good. And there have been no questions sent to us. Again, if you have questions, please send them using the question on the navigation pane. Frank, it's back to you.
Okay, so when we talk about conventional design in healthcare and clean room environments, I'm sure that none of you would disagree that the 7 bullets that are being shown are actually things that we use to incorporate in our designs for clean environments or clean spaces. Now, if these 7 items all worked, we wouldn't have nearly 2 million hospital-acquired infections every year in the United States. Now, there is a way to actually create a clean room environment without the use of particle control. And that basically can be done by brute force. And if you think about a clean room that's of class 1 standard, the way to do it is to go to 650 to 900 air changes per hour, and then take all of the people out of the room. And it's our position that we probably cannot go to 650 air changes inside of an operating room. So we need a way to actually make that happen without that huge expense. So when we think about particle control and how it works, it's based upon something that you learned a very, very long time ago. And those 2 things are basically that likes repel and unlikes attract. So The science of particle control is based on just that. And we actually take it a step further. We utilize charge, both plus and minus, and we utilize the ability of those particles after condition to actually collide into each other. When they collide, the mass of that forced collision increases, and airflow can now help us remove that contaminant from the space. By the way, one of the last things I'd like to mention is that most people forget that the strength of an ionic bond, which is a mechanical reaction usually created by charge, is 100 times stronger than a covalent bond. And covalent bonds, as we know, are chemical reactions. So our technology is actually utilizing ionic bonds. Okay, so now we're going to go back into the experimental approach and share with you some data. And Dr. Areth is going to take over from here.
Well, thanks once again. Every time I hear Frank explain this, I literally, kind of go, wow, this really is cool stuff, because we've never, in the operating room, I never ever looked at the need to charge, collide, and then capture particles. I've never ever thought of that, and yet it's such an elegant solution to obviously a life-threatening problem. So let's go through a couple of things first. The technology that we're discussing today, for your information, is TUV and UL safety certified. The power consumptions, the requirements are exceptionally low, pretty much like a light bulb. And as Frank was just talking about, this is a mechanical process. There's no chemistry, so there's no unknown compounds that can come out of this device. So it's just a mechanical process of the development of these charge particles, and then the collision, and then their exclusion from the air environment. The system does have a safety switch, as you could imagine, and unlike ionic air cleaners that were popular years ago, this does not produce any ozone. Remember, ozone is not good for your body, and it can hurt you, and so there's zero ozone production. So first of all, let's talk about a pathogen inactivation study. So this is a study that comes from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and in essence, the scientists there conducted an experiment whereby they exposed Bacillus subtilis, which is an anthrax surrogate, to the particle control technology. And here you can see the controls in colony forming units. That's the number of bacterial count, colony forming units per milliliter under the control setting, and then at 3 different sites that were pulled in duplicate from the results of the study. So here you have the control Petri dish in the middle, and then 3 other dishes around it that were for the various sites 1, 2, and 3. And so the conclusion of this work was that over 90 to 99% of all of these pathogens were killed within 3 hours, and so very rapid kill rate. The second thing is, if we start to look at, this is the results of a portable unit that was placed into an operating room that had already been HEPA filtered, okay? And so with the air particle control system off, you can see that you have in red here a large amount of particles, large counts of particles, and here you have a spike that happens very quickly, and then some degradation. If you take a look at with the APS system on, you see here that your baseline is much, much lower, and that when you do have a spike, that spike lasts much shorter period of time. So there's rapid clearance, and it turns out to be 76% clearance rate. This is the results from an experiment conducted in Pennsylvania, in which we had 2 adjacent operating rooms that were supplied by the same ventilation system. On the left, you see operating room number 3 in this case, which consisted of a pre-filter, a MERV-14 filter, and HEPA filtration. And you see that the average particle count was 93,000 over the period of time. If you then take a look and that was over 4 days. If you then take a look at the adjacent operating room, which had only a pre-filter and the secure air device, which is MERV rated 15, you can see that the particle counts were significantly less, almost minuscule. In fact, here we have a 90%, 96% cleanup rate for the particle. So I can tell you that I would much rather be in this operating room over here, number 4, as opposed to number 3 if I was having my abdomen opened up. Here in the Lake Tahoe Surgery Center, this was the first surgical hospital location where this was placed. PM 2.5 counts here again. Here you can see in red without the secure air system, and then in blue with the secure air system in place. And you can see that all of the, not only is the baseline, the average count lower, but you can see in response to various spikes, there's a rapid clearance of those particles. And here, taking a look at total volatile organic compounds as well, you can see very similar results. Much higher in red without secure air, and in blue with secure air. This is a letter testifying, stating that in fact, for the 3 years after the installation of the system, they went from a perioperative infection rate of 5.6% down to 0%. The reason we don't have information beyond those 3 years is that the this facility was purchased by somebody else who no longer operates it. So 0 hospital-acquired infections since this device was installed back in January of 2006. So let's take a look at question number 4. Do HEPA filters along with particle control technology have a large effect on the particle counts in a space? So do HEPA filters combined with particle control technology? So again, HEPA plus secure air, do they have a big effect?
Let me say yes. Okay, a few more seconds. Okay, close the poll. And the answer to that one is yes, 90% got that right. And we do have a few questions here.
Okay.
The first question is, are you seeing particle control used successfully in clean rooms used for compounding drugs or making electronics? Frank?
Well, I think I'll let Frank answer that question.
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and thank you for posing it. So the answer is yes. We are now seeing the technology being specified into compounding pharmacies, and from a clean room semiconductor application, we have yet to do that.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, the next question is really a two-part question. It's how does Secure Air's technology not release ozone? And also, how does your technology differ from your competitors' technology? So it's a two-part question. First one was ozone, and then second one, competitors. Frank, I think that.
Well, yes, we'll handle the ozone question. So ozone is generated by voltage, which is typically high voltage, and how that high voltage is delivered. So for example, do you use a point source? Do you use a wire? Do you use something else? So Secure Air has, in fact, come up with the appropriate mix of high voltage and shape on how that high voltage is delivered. And we've actually proven by multiple tests that our unit does not produce ozone. From a competitive standpoint, Dave, I think we could handle that question afterwards. We'd rather talk about particle control technology and continue on with some of the results.
Okay, we have the person who asked the question, and we will contact them later. Next question: has the APS system been approved and/or recognized by any codes or authority having jurisdictions?
Okay, so the code question is an excellent question. So our technology is rated MERV 15. So by being rated MERV 15, we meet any of those code requirements. The only one that we currently do not meet is we are not HEPA rated. So if there is a requirement for a HEPA rated product, we do not meet that. And again, that is as of today. Tomorrow may be different.
And we have one last question. If we use APS system, can the CFM be reduced but still meet the code? And I think you mean the outside air CFM.
The answer to that is absolutely yes. And we can actually provide direct calculations based upon the specifics of the treated space or building.
Okay, thank you, Frank. That's it for the questions right now. Let's continue on to the presentation.
Well, thanks once again. So I'd like to introduce you to the experimental design of the study that I did last February. And here we have a typical operating room that was about 22 by 23 feet with 10-foot high ceilings. And here you see a lot of the typical apparatus that you normally have in an operating room, of course, all around the patient's bed. On to the next slide. Here we have the baseline particle counts. We established our baseline particle counts. We looked at not only, for some reason my cursor is not allowing me to do things right now. I'm sorry. At any rate, we looked over the course of a week at different types of operations that were happening within the environment, as well as determining the baseline established particle count for those weeks. We then were able to turn on, activate the ACS system, again, looked at various operating activities, and you can see here a 94% cleanup rate in the reduction of particle count. So similar volume of operation, similar time of operation. And when we did our analysis, we did both on the analysis with the operating room active and with the operating room dormant as at nighttime, and somewhat similar results in that you had a significant reduction. When we then turned the device off and looked at the following time, you see a very large increase in some of this drift that occurs as particle counts increase significantly. And so once again, demonstrating that the device is very effective at significantly reducing particle counts in operating rooms. This is the baseline information here just in tabular form. And here in that second column, you can see the baseline data, the values with the particle control technology and with HEPA, comparing it to HEPA. And you see that with HEPA, there are significant, there's a reduction in particle count, but it's only about a 40% reduction, as opposed to with particle control technology, where you get a 94% improvement. And so there you have that summary. All right, question number 5. In the actual test, were HEPA filters effective on pathogen kill rates in the operating room?
Okay, just a few more seconds here. Okay, we're going to close the question, and the answer is no, and 76% of you got the answer correct. And
Yes.
We do have a question here. Can this technology remove odors such as diesel fumes?
The answer is yes. And Frank, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I would say the simple answer is definitely yes. As you know, HEPA filters do not stop odors, and our technology in comparison to the HEPA filter is actually superior. So odors, yes.
So there you have it. You have odors, you have particles, and as mentioned in question number 5, HEPA does not kill pathogens, but in fact, the ACS system does, the secure air technology. So
Okay.
late-breaking results. A colleague of mine, Jason Orme, Jason is one of these really smart guys that is doing some really cool stuff. He's taking in his laboratory, chopping different pieces of DNA, inserting them, and in that process, he's able to begin to target cancer cell surface proteins. And so he's sitting in a laboratory that's about the same size as an operating room, and this is from now it's 2 months old. And in essence, he was complaining to me that he had microparticle contamination and ultrafine dust collection in this laboratory, and he was looking to try to clean it up as best he could. And the very next morning, I got a text, and he texted. He said it works incredibly well. So this is from one of the biotech laboratories at the Mayo Clinic Business Accelerator Research Facility. So in summary, I think that we know that indoor air quality benefits from high MERV response, specifically with the Inactivate technology, by being able to kill airborne pathogens. We know that this has lowered in the past hospital-acquired infection rates. We anticipate that that will be confirmed in more and more studies as it goes out. And we certainly anticipate also that you'll see an increased rate in disease recovery. The particle control technology, as mentioned, works on volatile organic compounds, smoke, odors, dissolved gases, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, in addition to just the particles and pathogens themselves. So in summary, we know that airborne particles cause or contribute to hospital-acquired infections, in addition to hardening of the arteries, declining cognitive function, and Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So remember, there is a clear line now between airborne particulate exposure, microparticulate exposure, and these deadly diseases. Secondly, we know that conventional methods do not allow for transfer of that microparticle contaminant. Remember, it's Brownian motion that controls it, and without some other effect, without some electrostatic effect or some other effect, you're not going to get movement of those particles towards a filter where they can be captured. Particle control technology does, in fact, reduce critical airborne contamination. These results are both measurable and reportable, and they will reduce and have reduced hospital-acquired infections. The other thing that I think is really important as we think about this, pathogens can survive on lots of different surfaces within a hospital environment. And certainly there is a buildup of almost a biofilm or a bioburden on various filter media. And that, of course, can serve to provide a nidus for the collection of and the essentially the growth of bacteria and contaminants. And we have an example of this just recently with the onset of development of some infections in patients having heart surgery because of the biofilm that builds up on different components of the heart-lung machine. And as a result of that, there is airborne contamination from this biofilm buildup, and then patients have gotten sick, ill, and many have died. And so this is some ongoing work that's going on now in heart surgery, and this is an area by which particle control technology could reduce a particle count and eliminate the airborne transmission of these pathogens. That's the end of the formal presentation. As Mr. Taylor mentioned earlier, this is his contact information, so please feel free to reach out to him, and I will open it up to David and to Frank, and I'll sit in the background. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. We have had 2 questions come in during the summary here. The first question is, what is the pressure drop versus HEPA filters through the advanced collection system? Frank, I think that would be in your court.
Okay, so the pressure drop for the ACS system at MER 15 at 500 feet a minute is 0.28 inches. So if you comparatively think about the HEPA filter, which usually starts at about 1.5 inches, you're dramatically reduced in that regard.
And one more question, have you given any thought to the possibility that a technology like particle control could cause a rise in superbugs in air systems and occupied spaces?
So that's actually an excellent question, and the fact is that we know that superbugs come from lots of different places within hospitals, and airborne contamination is an increasingly important part of the pathogenesis of superbug infections. And so there's no question that if you wanted to eliminate superbugs from developing, you absolutely will have to be able to control airborne contamination. And I think we've demonstrated today both laboratory and clinical results to show you that, in fact, this is very effective at dropping airborne contamination by 95% or greater.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Frank. This is a great presentation, and I know this is on the minds of many of the engineers' customers, the hospitals, and I think this is a great solution for that. We will have a recorded session, and we will send that out to everybody who registered for it, so you can watch it later on. If you want more information, you can visit their website at Secure Air, that's air with an E, secureair.com. Or please see your TEC territory representative, or please contact me for further information to discuss this technology. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.